It's great to see all of you in this cold evening for one of our long-standing departmental traditions, the annual faculty lecture. And it is an occasion for us to hear from one of our colleagues about their recent or current research project, and then to congregate downstairs for our annual holiday party. I want to thank Jonathan Zimmer for putting this event together, and to departmental staff, Alex, Jen, Tammy, for their work on various aspects of organization. It's a good note to end the year in what has been a rather trying year in many ways, both world events and the academic and administrative aspects of the university. But this is a happy occasion and a good note to end the year with. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Barnes Nugent Bequest sponsors this event and many of our other talks and events over the years. Barnes Nugent graduated from Queen's in 1938 and left behind her estate for us, for the department. And since 2008, we have been able to host many noteworthy events, and I thank Mrs. Nugent every day. With that, let me now introduce my colleague, Professor Andrew Jainchill. Andrew is a very prominent scholar of 18th century France, the French Revolution, and the history of political thought. After completing his BA from Reed College, Andrew completed his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in 2004 and began his career at Queen's that year. His first book, Reimagining Politics After the Terror, The Republican Origins of French Liberalism, Cornell University Press 2008, was shortlisted for the Wallace K. Ferguson Prize awarded by the Canadian Historical Association. The book has been extensively reviewed and written about, as some of you know. In 2019, Andrew published a critical edition with an extensive introduction on some of d'Argenson's previously unpublished writings. Most recently, Andrew has just completed his second monograph titled A Radical Reformer in the Old Regime, currently under review with a major press. We'll hear more from this book in today's talk. Apart from his books, Andrew has been quite prolific in writing numerous articles and chapters for some of the most prestigious venues. The list is long and it's significant, but if I have to recount that, I would have to pronounce quite a few French words, which I always try to avoid, so I'll leave it at that. Apart from his scholarship, Andrew is one of our foremost instructors. Very early on in his career, Andrew was nominated for the Frank Knox Teaching Award, and over the years, he has been nominated for several teaching awards within the university. In 2022, Andrew won our department's Teaching Excellence Award. And Andrew has won numerous other grants and scholarships and residential fellowships, including a year-long fellowship at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Paris. Andrew is the first faculty member I met the day I first arrived at Queen's. He was packing up his office, which was to become my office for the next 10 years. He left behind a desk, a telephone extension number, a wooden ruler, and an ancient empty bottle of Jack Daniels, which he claimed wasn't his. And if you know him, it is true. And I left it there when I gave the office over to Scott in 2019. I don't know what he has done with it. And there's a lot one can say about a colleague's publications, scholarships, teaching awards, and the like. But there are some things we know from working with them. So let me close this with a few things that are personal. I've learned an enormous amount from Andrew. When I first arrived a few weeks after defending my thesis, perhaps inadvertently, Andrew brought me up to speed with what it meant to be a professor. In those early years, we spoke often, and I learned from him how to think about historical issues and why and how one should read both deeply and widely. I remember one afternoon he walked into my office, and I remember things visually. And I remember he was wearing a gray sweater, and he saw a book on my desk, and there was no reason for him to recognize the book because it was in a field far removed from his interests. But Andrew asked me whether I had read the two other books this author had written, and published in a field far removed from Andrew's. About a year later, he was wearing the same gray sweater. Andrew came by and pointed out some holes in my reading on a topic far closer to my interest than his. Such is his range, and this has tremendously inspired me over the years. In every conversation I have with him, I come away learning something new from what he said, and occasionally what I guessed he said. Andrew Jainchill is a treasure. He is a fantastic scholar, a committed instructor and supervisor, and a beloved colleague. Please welcome my friend, Andrew Jainchill.
Thank you for that too generous introduction. Okay, so as Amitabha said, I've recently completed a book manuscript called A Radical Reformer in the Old Regime, the Political Thought of the Marquis d'Argenson. D'Argenson was a political writer and statesman who called for some of the most far-reaching reforms of the 18th century. Little known today in the Anglosphere, and with a surprising paucity of scholarship on him in French as well, he is the quintessential, unjustly neglected thinker whose reputation in posterity has not equaled that in his own lifetime. There is no book-length study in English or French devoted to his political thought. And although there have been 2 dissertations on it, one in the United States in 1968 and one in France in 2004, neither of them ever appeared as a monograph, and there are only a handful of articles about his thought or that mention his thought. This, despite the fact that he was widely praised in the 18th century as an important political thinker by Rousseau, Voltaire, Condorcet, and many others. Now, his most important work of political theory, The Considerations on Government, was composed in the 1730s, began to circulate in manuscript in 1739, and was then posthumously published in 1764 after Rousseau cited the manuscript 4 times in The Social Contract. No other work was cited as frequently in The Social Contract. D'Argenson's text combined a scathing indictment of the existing order with a blueprint for reform that aimed to dramatically remake France's political and social order. This is the published text from 1764, and this is one of the 4 manuscripts of the text. It could be said, he wrote of the effects of his proposed reforms, that by this change in the government, the kingdom would change face. Now, the basis of d'Argenson's reformist vision was a plan to democratize the monarchy. You can see the title is, the title translates to how far democracy can be admitted into monarchical government. And so this idea or image of extending democracy as far as possible is evoked many times in his notes. For instance, one of them refers to my system of democracy pushed as far as it can extend in a monarchy. And it needs to be stressed that this was an exceedingly rare instance from the 18th century and in many ways from the early modern period altogether of a political writer calling for democracy. And it should also be noticed that d'Argenson himself never used the term consideration as a title. Seems to be invented by Marc Michel Rey, who was one of the most notorious clandestine publishers of the 18th century and was Rousseau's publisher, who got the edition out, and there's a whole story about the manuscripts there. As Amitabha mentioned, a few years ago, I published a critical edition of that text based on 4 different manuscripts held in different archives and libraries around France. This is a page from the first edition, so you can just kind of see what this was like as a project. So what did it mean to democratize the monarchy? The 2 aspects I'll focus on this evening are 1, dismantling the legacy of feudalism in France, which entailed reducing the power of the nobility and pursuing land reform, so democracy as equality. And second, instituting what d'Argenson called popular administration, which would devolve essential functions of government into the hands of what he called popular and municipal magistrates at the head of each community, that is to say, each city, town, or village. Those are his words describing that. Now, d'Argenson sketched this reform plan during a time of transition for the monarchy, when, following the disastrous final decades of Louis XIV's long rule, the monarchy was changing gears, caught between forces for continuity and for change. In d'Argenson's view, the system was rotten and the monarchy stood in urgent need of change. D'Argenson, however, was not an outsider railing against the system. He was an insider, a titled noble who spent most of his adult life in service to the king. Part of my project thus asks the question, how is it that this radical reformer emerged from within the system? Now, he was the oldest son of a noble family that claimed ancient nobility to 877. This is from a family genealogy commissioned by his father, who's a powerful figure I'll speak about a moment ago. 877 is obviously a lie, but the point is it's this claim to ancient title among the what were called the nobles of the sword. Then in the 17th century, his great-grandfather was the first to move into the royal administration, what was called the noble of the robe, administrative service to the king, and enjoyed an extraordinarily successful career. And incidentally, the subject of Michel de Certeau's first publication was on d'Argenson's grandfather, or great-grandfather, excuse me. Now, his father, who is known to people who are interested in the history of policing, was the Lieutenant General of the Police of Paris and an extraordinarily powerful figure during d'Argenson's youth. I mean, a towering figure in 18th century France in the first decades of the 18th century. And so d'Argenson was raised with every expectation of continuing in this line of service to the king. And to understand the way he moved within the royal administration, we also have to understand this dual position of being from an ancient family of the sword, but who had moved into the robe. So it meant that basically they moved within the highest ranks of the administration, but they didn't feel sort of overshadowed, so to speak, by the other ancient families of France. And so he began his career in office in 1715, and then in 1720, his father leveraged a political concession to have him and his younger brother promoted to important positions at an extraordinarily young age. D'Argenson was made a counselor of state and an intendant. He was probably the youngest counselor of state of the entire century and one of the youngest intendants of the century as well. And a counselor of state there's only 35 in France at the time. Other than ministers, they're the only ones who have the right to enter the royal council. You have to have had legal training, and you provide advice on decisions before the monarchy. Intendants are royal officials who are responsible for administering provinces, and they report directly to the Controller General. And there's 31 in continental France at the time. So this is an extraordinarily quick ascension in 1720. Then his career languished in comparison to his ambition and in comparison to his younger brother's career until he was eventually selected for one of the two coveted positions for a counselor of state on the Council of Finances in May 1744. The intendancy, which I'll return to, ran from 1720 to 1724, but he resigned it. Then he continued as a counselor of state, this kind of languishing. Then shortly after this ascension to the Council of Finances, he was appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs in November of that year, which was sort of what he had been working for his whole career. And unfortunately, his tenure only lasted 2.5 years and is widely judged a failure. When his appointment to the ministry seemed likely, he wrote to his brother, who was then Minister of War, asking his brother for support in securing the position, but then added, with his characteristically brusque and self-defeating assertions of principle, that I want your help, but I will nonetheless be inclined to work against you, against your ministry, the Ministry of War, by procuring and trying to maintain peace. and he became known as d'Argenson la paix, d'Argenson peace, for his single-minded focus on ending the War of Austrian Succession during his tenure as Minister of Foreign Affairs. Now, one of the arguments I make in this book is that d'Argenson's reformist vision was shaped by these experiences in the royal administration, that they gave him a sense of both what needed to be done and what could be accomplished. That is often, that kind of experience is often missing, supposedly, in 18th century writers. Tocqueville has a famous characterization that's surprisingly enduring of 18th century philosophes as sort of out of touch with reality because they have no actual political experience. And d'Argenson is one among a handful of figures who I think sort of contradict this, again, surprisingly enduring Tocquevillian characterization of the 18th century. Okay, so d'Argenson was, in short, both an ambitious insider and a fierce critic of the system. The philosopher and mathematician Condorcet would note this, stating on the eve of the revolution that it was, quote, "from the ranks of the nobility, the court, and the ministry that arose the first voice in favor of equality and the true interests of the people." Now, d'Argenson, in addition to this career in administration, he was also an active philosophe and a compulsive reader and writer. He participated in the celebrated Salon of Madame de Lambert, the short-lived but famous Club de l'Entresol, which is another important academy, and then was later an active member and president of one of the 5 academies of the Institut de France, the National Institute. And he wrote literally, he wrote compulsively. He wrote thousands of remarks while reading, thoughts on the reformation of the state, all sorts of things like this, and kept a journal recording the political events of the day, which was published in 9 volumes in the 19th century, and it is now one of the most important sources for historians working on the 18th century. Now, the reading notes and thoughts on the reformation of the state were almost all lost when the library in the Louvre burned in the final days of the Paris Commune in 1871. But it turned out that they had been copied by hand by d'Argenson's great-nephew, a 19th century politician, in preparation for an edition of d'Argenson's writings in the 19th century. And the great-nephew only published part of what he intended. But these copies remained in the family's hands until 1976, when they were finally made available to the public at the library of the University of Poitiers. However, almost no one has studied them. So my book and this is just the table of contents, the projected table of contents of the book. And I use is the first work to use these sources as well, systematically, and as well as or in conjunction with numerous other archival holdings in the Arsenal Library in Paris, the French National Archives, the Archives of the North, for his intendancy, the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so, as I said, these papers have never really been used. So I should acknowledge that I had a stroke of luck when working in his papers in the Poitiers Library. I arranged a meeting with the former director of the Rare Books collection who had cataloged the papers because I was skeptical about the attribution of a piece in those papers to d'Argenson by another scholar. So I asked to meet with this retired director, Monsieur Delhomme, and we sat down and looked at these papers together, and he confirmed my reading, and thus that this other scholar's interpretation didn't hold up. But after we chatted for a little while, he told me he had made transcriptions of a vast quantity of these papers. This was a very welcome news to me, and that he allowed me to make copies of his transcriptions. He had been preparing a publication of them in the 1980s and sort of, I guess, gave up on the project. So this was a lifeline given the dense handwriting in these papers. And some of you maybe were also at the AI workshop with last week that was in the department, where we were told that, that the AI is not really good at reading handwriting. So after the workshop, I fed one of these into Google Gemini, and this is what I was told. Score one for the humans. Okay. So this is the manuscript that is in that is sort of the centerpiece of two of those chapters I mentioned. D'Argenson, as I said, it was intent on dismantling the legacy of feudalism in France. And this was what he called the legacy of feudalism in France. And this was announced in the original subtitle of the manuscript, which is a little grainy to read here, but it translates to, "This treatise on politics was composed on the occasion of those by Boulainvilliers concerning the former feudal government of France." And then the second sentence of the preface declares that one of the text's goals was to establish against the principles of Boulainvilliers the imperfections of feudal government. Now, Boulainvilliers is the century's most famous feudist, and the modern historian of feudalism, Marc Bloch, says that Boulainvilliers coined the term feudal government. So his arguments on behalf of feudal government and feudalism are powerful in the 18th century. And this may seem out of place when talking about the 18th century, but it remains feudalism. One of the things I want to argue, and I hope to do this further in a journal article or some other piece, is that they remain central to 18th century political debates. And so Foucault, for example, insisted with only modest exaggeration in his lectures in the 1970s that the entire 18th century at the level of law, history, and politics was obsessed with the problem of feudalism. And I think he was right about this, and that this perspective is missing in a lot of the historiography on political debate in the 18th century. Okay. Now, ending feudal government in practical terms meant displacing nobility and ultimately doing away with the nobility. The reforms he proposed left no place for the nobility. As he stated near the end of the treatise, it will be said that the principles of the present treatise, favorable to democracy, will lead to the destruction of the nobility. And that will not be a mistake. It is not an objection. It is a confirmation of the intended consequences. So he's pretty clear. Now, D'Argenson insisted that the nobility in France had become both historically obsolete and too separate from the population at large. An early, pensée thought declared that the great lords should be absolutely destroyed because they were no longer useful to the state. The nobility, in his view, stood all but outside French society and contributed nothing. In a journal entry from 1750, he called on the state to diminish the power of the nobility, substitute for it that of the commune, of democracy admitted with equality, and you will have a good government. So ending feudalism and noble power would help to bring about a political order based on equality as a first-order political value. While accepting that absolute equality was not possible, he argued for the importance of establishing the principle and what should be and working toward it. One of his thoughts on the reformation of the state from around this time referred to equality as, quote, political perfection. He even praised a text by a figure named Morali, a text called the Code de la Nature, which is a text that attacked the entire notion of private property. It was arguably the most radical text of the entire 18th century, radically egalitarian text of the entire century. He called it an excellent book, the book of books. Nobody would have said that right at the time. In an essay D'Argenson submitted to a competition held by the Academy of Dijon in 1754 on the origins of inequality, famous because it's the same competition to which Rousseau submitted his discourse on the origins of inequality. D'Argenson wrote in his submission, "Inequality was one of the greatest evils of society, and he demanded that government should adopt the principle of equality, and the face of the earth will change." Neither D'Argenson nor Rousseau won the competition. Okay, so equality for D'Argenson pointedly involved material equality. It wasn't just an abstract notion. In the treatise, he bemoaned just how much, quote, "the inequality of wealth is an evil among citizens. And he described democracy as tending toward the equality of wealth. He called the equality of property a perfection to be desired in the state. Now, the most important and concrete measure he advocated to promote such material equality was land reform, notably the reallocation of noble and royal lands to the peasantry. And this explicitly meant unwinding the legacy of feudalism and returning land to its ostensibly pre-feudal condition. It is to be hoped that all property in the countryside would be free, exempt of all feudal dues, as they were when first cleared by our forefathers. That is the way the entire that in this way the entire kingdom should be solely commoner-owned land free of seigneurial rights, which is an inelegant translation of a technical term, Franco de Rotier. This is certainly what democracy would demand if it were ever allowed to influence the reform of the laws. So the alleu or allod was land that was not subject to a lord, and these lands disappeared under feudalism for the most part. So there were fewer and fewer lands that were free of seigneurial rights, of the rights of lordship. Then in the 17th century, the monarchy began to try to subsume those remaining lands that were not under lordship, claiming its own rights over them, effectively royal lordship. The monarchy adopted the stance of a noble in this sense, and sort of tried to feudalize a lot of the lands that had not been feudalized in the medieval period. And so in the treatise, d'Argenson called for all of these lands, royal and noble, to be defeudalized. He slammed what was sort of the guiding feudalist principle of no land without a lord. He called it detestable, and argued that really there should be no land with a lord, with a seigneur. And in doing this, he even quotes, some of the most radical land reform programs of antiquity, notably those of the Spartan lawgiver Lycurgus, and the notorious, which is not so uncommon in the 18th century, but he also quotes the notorious Roman agrarian law, which is really sort of pushing the point much further. During the French Revolution in March of 1793, they instituted the death penalty for anyone who called for the Roman agrarian law. So just to give you a sense of what the term meant. And he knew, of course, that this was not going to happen. There was never going to be this massive redistribution of land, and that he said the nobility will undoubtedly always remain the greatest obstacle to any reform of this kind, but he wanted it to be kind of on the table, to be talked about, and he was hoping that the monarchy would take the lead, that the king could be convinced to take the lead. Okay. Now, it's difficult to pinpoint when d'Argenson became so concerned with the material situation of the peasantry. But both calls to reform and depictions of rural immiseration recur repeatedly in his writings. Perhaps the earliest example is a journal entry from 1725 that just breathes with disgust while recounting the treatment of peasants by government officials near his country home. At the time, the soon-to-be queen, Marie Leszczyńska, had arrived in France, was on her way to the royal nuptials, and the population of the regime was conscripted for corvée labor to build the roads for her to pass. This happens a couple of times a year. It's not uncommon. But at this point, and this is what he's outraged about, is it happens during the harvest. So the people can't go and do the harvest because they have to make the road smoother for the soon-to-be queen. And he writes, "I will never forget the horror of the calamities suffered. The region," he wrote, "was already on the verge of famine due to heavy rain, and just the moment when everyone needs to be in the field gathering the harvest, they're forced to perform this corvée labor on the roads." The roads were nonetheless in such disrepair, he recounted, that the queen's horses became exhausted, and so horses from the region were commandeered to help the queen move through when, again, they needed to be in the fields on the harvest. And so he's horrified by this, and he dresses up and travels incognito and travels into the town square to talk to people about this, which I do not think was that common among sort of titled nobles in the 18th century. So anyway, so his journal is just replete with these kind of descriptions and this sort of outrage and depictions of royal indifference and noble indifference to the suffering of France's peasants. This made an impression on Tocqueville in his notes on an early 1825 edition, a very Baudelarized version of d'Argenson's journal. One of these passages, Tocqueville wrote, "See the power of a bad government," in his reading notes on some of these descriptions. So d'Argenson's desire to improve the situation of France's peasants was a guiding principle of his proposed reforms. But it should be noted, he virtually disregarded the urban poor whose ranks were growing in the 18th century. He viewed the increasing urban poverty around him as more or less an extension of the immiseration of the countryside, noting at a number of points that the urban poor the growth in the urban poor was because peasants were leaving the countryside because of poorer government in the countryside and going to the cities. So he really his sort of vision of the poverty in France that needed to be addressed was very much limited to the rural world, which is the overwhelming percentage of the population, but he seemed to have something of a blind eye to the urban poverty around him. Okay. Now, the other part of his reform program of democratizing that I want to talk about this evening is, in addition to the sort of ending feudalism and ameliorating the situation in the countryside, is the establishment of what he called popular administration, which he detailed in a 54-article plan that took up over 10% of the text. So for him, democracy is really in the details. And this is, I think, somewhat unique in the history of political thought. The plan's linchpin was the creation of what he called popular and municipal magistrates, as I mentioned before, who stood at the head of each community, that is to say, each town or village. And this, as you can see it here in the first two drafts of the manuscript. In the section of the text on principles, they're outlining some of the guiding principles. He called the right of the commune, or the municipal magistrates or popular officers, the true democracy that resides in the middle of the monarchy, a sentiment he also expressed in a letter to Voltaire when sending him the manuscripts. The magistrates would fill many of the essential functions of government, but he thought would keep an eye on the interests of the people because they came up sort of locally in a way I'll speak about in a moment. But they'd still report to royal officers, but those royal officers would become more inspectors than active administrators. Now, the magistrates would be selected through a version of election called scrutin, which had been devised by his friend the Abbé Saint-Pierre. And significantly, d'Argenson did not stipulate any kind of property, education, or status qualifications to become a magistrate. At one point, he stated that they might even be peasants. Saint-Pierre, when he read the manuscripts, suggested to d'Argenson that the treatise's real goal was the inhabitants' choice of their municipal officers. So he said, what you're really talking about is just the local level here. But as I said, democratic government for d'Argenson would lie in the details of this administration. And these magistrates would possess substantial autonomy and power, notably in fiscal matters and the collection of taxes. They would raise revenue, that is, they would set taxes in whatever manner they judged the least burdensome to their communities. So they were given free rein to come up with new forms of taxation if they wanted. And within that framework, he wrote, each body of popular magistracy will have in its district the same power and the same functions as the estates of a province in those areas of France which enjoy this right, and they will give to the king in the form of a voluntary gift the same amount as His Majesty today claims from all taxes, including this crucial tax called the tithe. Now, the description and key terms of this are significant. First, d'Argenson suggested that the magistrates' power and functions be patterned on those provincial estates. There's some of the regions of France are highly self-governing at this point, notably Brittany and Languedoc, and they levied taxes independently and then made what were called a voluntary gift to the monarchy. The term voluntary gift originally came from the clergy, which had an analogous arrangement, which saw it give a gift to the monarchy every 5 years in lieu of paying taxes. And naming these gifts, the amounts of which were negotiated with the monarchy, allowed these particular provinces and the clergy to maintain fiscal privileges, essentially fictions of fiscal privilege, because they had to come up with something. But calling them a voluntary gift emphasized their privilege and their independence. And so, for example, in the estates of Languedoc, the first order of business every year was to vote to the consent of the annual voluntary gift. Now, this is purely symbolic, it's performative, but the term voluntary gift, don gratuit, is everyone knows what that means. This is a loaded term. And it implies this kind of reciprocity as well, as has been shown in a classic article by the historian Alain Gary. So by employing this term, d'Argenson rhetorically emphasized the independence that the magistrates and communities were to possess in fiscal matters. Now, the article also suggested that the revenue the magistrates collected in the least burdensome manner, as was said, would replace the taille, or would be some kind of alternative to the taille. The taille is the most important tax in France at the time. In 1715, it accounts for 27% of state revenue, and it's a direct tax based primarily on income from land, and fell disproportionately on the poor, on the peasants, because nobles and noble land in some parts of France were exempt from the taille. So really, it only falls on the peasants. D'Argenson repeatedly called for its elimination, or at the least massive reform, because he thought it disproportionately targeted those lowest on the socioeconomic ladder. And he argued the point repeatedly, at one point in the midst of a political crisis, that he's an active advisor to the first minister, Fleury. He takes advantage of having Fleury's ear to write him a memorandum on the importance of abolishing the taille, saying it's the greatest scourge of the monarchy, the most important issue facing the kingdom at the moment. I mean, it didn't get any traction, but this is a passion of his. So d'Argenson thus aimed both to make taxation more fair and, by giving the municipal magistrates so much discretion, to transform how the state and the population interacted in this most essential of government functions. The collection of taxes was the most common form of contact with the state for the majority of the population at this time, and it engendered constant displeasure. So d'Argenson's plan to fully root this process in communities aimed to fundamentally change this dynamic between state and population, especially the rural population. Now, the full range of functions the magistrates would be responsible for was extensive. In addition, they were responsible for police, which is a much more capacious term than it is now, and was highly associated with central authority and control. By putting that in the hands of the magistrates, it's really, again, a decentralizing and democratizing measure. So in arguing for this devolution of authority to the local level, d'Argenson, one of the key arguments he makes repeatedly in doing this is he talks about the limits of what central authority could know about the local level. This is a recurrent theme in both the treatise. It's about knowledge, really, about the ability of central authority to understand the local. And in later writings about the grain trade, which he publishes anonymously in the 1750s and are actually important pieces in sort of the history of political economic writing in the 18th century leading up to the deregulation of the grain trade in 1763 to 64, and then is quickly undone. But that's a whole other story. Furthermore, these municipal magistrates would crucially displace the nobility and other self-interested intermediary bodies. I mean, if they're taking over all these functions, you can just see the nobility kind of being pushed aside by this. And at one point in the plan, he even commented, and this relates to taxes as well as functions, but he even comments that if the local nobility were to object in any districts, troops will be sent in, and a few rigorous examples will soon bring everyone to the same opinion of respect and confidence toward the magistrates. So he's clear that, you know, the nobles are not going to cause problems. Okay. Now, one of the arguments I make in the book is that the development of d'Argenson's ideas about these municipal magistrates reflected his experiences as intendant of Hainaut, which is a district in the north of France. It's hard to see on this map, but it's up here basically bordering modern-day Belgium. And this is the district itself, which, as you can see, is a bit of a mess geographically. There's these exclaves that are in modern day in Belgium, basically in the Austrian Netherlands at the time. And one of the capital of the district, Valenciennes, which is over here, has a very strong tradition of local government. It possessed some of the oldest preserved municipal guild statutes in Europe and had a set of communal privileges that had been granted to it in 1302. A history of the city written in 1639 called it a republic. And the most important municipal offices in the city, however, were dominated by urban oligarchies that occupied those positions for extended periods. And during his intendancy, d'Argenson would clash with some of these local oligarchies a few times over what he judged to be corruption and the abuse of power on their part. So in one instance, in December 1721, d'Argenson came into conflict with one such local oligarch, a man named Malotot, over the setting of the city's accounts for the year. And basically, it began with kind of a technical thing. About who had to be present. This is d'Argenson's style. This is in the archives of the North. He's reading the regulations for how it's done. He's marking the passage in question. And the clash grew so intense, though, that d'Argenson eventually dashed off a letter to the Comptroller General in his own hand, because he didn't want to wait for a secretary and the usual thing. He wanted to get this to the Comptroller General as soon as possible, highlighting the problems that he says are being caused by a few magistrates who think that these positions are only for enriching themselves. And he says they appeal to the observation of their privileges whenever anything that unmasks them are invoked. So d'Argenson is battling with these local oligarchs, and as he is this representative of royal authority, in this area, clashing with local government. And he would clash with them again the following year when they were prioritizing repaying certain among the city's creditors at the expense of others. And he took the step of decreeing new procedures to introduce more oversight and what he claims would be fair payment procedures. Every week the city had to list all the creditors who had been paid that week, et cetera, so that there was more transparency and fairness to the process, or so he hoped. And what I want to do is focus on two ways this protracted episode, battling with these local officials, influenced his reform plans. First, he stipulated in the plan that the magistrates would have to be renewed every year. Nobody could stay in office for more than a year because he didn't want anyone to become entrenched in these positions. He didn't want one of these urban oligarchies to form. He wrote to the minister at the time requesting that policy be instituted, and even had his letter to the minister printed and posted throughout the region, thinking he could get popular support behind this. But it went nowhere. This is a border region. The monarchy has to, recently annexed during Louis XIV's wars, the monarchy has to tread carefully and sort of taking on local authority like that. And he recounted later in his journal that I watched with great impatience the continuation of municipal magistrates in these positions for more than a year. This resulted, he continued, in making a few rascals feel proud. They mistreated the people, they made a tyranny of their magistratures, and negligence and abuse followed. Now, the episode is significant for a number of reasons, but partly because d'Argenson is the representative of royal authority taking a heavy-handed approach in this instance. And he later reflected ruefully that he had not been more respectful of local custom during his time as intendant, writing that, "I wanted their greatest good, but I went there young and without experience. I did not respect their customs. I did not respect basically the way they did things. I mistreated this Malotot, who was the man of the people, even if he was a rascal. I recognized that I was in the wrong." So from this lesson, And this thought of his is among a handful of thoughts that revolve around this question of municipal autonomy while he's drafting the considerations. They suggest that he drew these lessons concerning the importance both of respecting local autonomy and of building institutional safeguards against local elites becoming rascals, right, as he described them. So d'Argenson's clash with Valenciennes' municipal oligarchy and the lessons he drew is thus of particular interest because it entailed this sustained encounter over the inevitable friction between municipal autonomy and central authority, and the negotiation of this would form a constitutive part of d'Argenson's later reform plans. And there are other significant examples from his time as intendant, notably an experiment in regulating the grain trade, which he later became a fierce advocate of. He radically broke with established procedure at the time, convinced the Comptroller General to let him engage in this experiment with a free grain trade, and this draws the ire of the intendant of Lille, the neighboring province, who happens to be his father-in-law. Okay. So, d'Argenson's searing critique of the legacy of feudalism in French political life and his calls for egalitarian reform and robust local government, as well as calls for reform to France's political economy and to practices of religious government, which I did not have time to go into this evening, were really among the most radical proposed during the 18th century. They suggest, in a way that the historiography, I think, has not fully grappled with, that such reformist writings could emerge from within the monarchy, from insiders. They also suggest that the kinds of critique typically assumed to begin with the so-called High Enlightenment later in the century were already developing and even circulating in manuscript beforehand. D'Argenson's writings anticipated, at a conceptual level, a handful of important reforms in the later 18th century, such as a reform of municipalities instituted in the 1760s. You can see the obvious connection there, as well as certain key developments of the early French Revolution, notably the ending of feudalism, the abolition of noble titles, and the attempt to create an alliance between democracy and monarchy, which is how his work was sometimes invoked in the halls of the National Assembly. Conceptual lines can also be traced from d'Argenson's political program to the more radical phases of the revolution and to Jacobinism, notably in its goal of instituting egalitarian reform, and at a more abstract level in its aim of eliminating any mediating bodies between the sovereign and the people, although crucially, the sovereign in d'Argenson's writings would remain the monarch, while in Jacobinism it would be the people. In a longer-term perspective, his emphasis on democracy as local government and on distributing power in this way to make local government responsive to the needs of individual communities amounted to an original contribution to the history of democratic thought that has only been occasionally acknowledged by historians of the subject. John Donne is an exception. He gives d'Argenson 5 pages in a book on democracy, and as I've said, has never been the subject of a sustained study. D'Argenson called for democratizing the municipal level in order to reach the overwhelming majority of the population, who at that time lived overwhelmingly local and rural lives. To the vast majority of the population, that would entail a dramatic transformation in their experience of what government actually did and who it served. As he wrote to Voltaire when discussing the manuscript in 1739, I mean real politics, that which would go to ensuring that the peasants are well-fed and well-clothed. D'Argenson's contributions to the history of egalitarian political thought are also noteworthy. The historian of the French nobility, Guy Chaucinan-Nogueret, wrote that, that no one went further than him in criticisms of the nobility and called him the first socialist. The Russian anarchist, Peter Kropotkin, noted in passing that d'Argenson was perhaps the first communist, or he says one of the first to go under the name of communism. However, few historians have included him in histories of the idea of equality. Now, his egalitarianism, like his version of democracy, aim to improve the day-to-day lives of France's peasants. he aimed to deploy state power to undo the pervasive and deep-rooted inequality that saturated French society at the time. He wanted to try to achieve egalitarian ends and create a social political order that would be far more equal than that which existed and more equal than virtually any other proposed in the century. Now, as I said, D'Argenson, like many others at the time, his vision of equality was also marked by pronounced limits. He had little to say about the poverty of France's increasing urban population. The plight of the enslaved peoples of France's colonies barely registered in his political writings, and he rarely spoke of women. The promise of democracy and equality and the limits of how those are defined are all too familiar in the history of political thought and today. I have focused this evening on aspects of D'Argenson's plan to extend democracy within the monarchy, notably the sort of defeudalization, equality, and local government. The full range of problems he confronted and the policies he advocated pointed to achieving this balance among central authority and municipal government, attentive to local needs, to mobilizing the resources of the state to mitigate inequality and injustice, to subordinating religion to the state and keeping the state neutral in matters of religious governance, to reducing conspicuous consumption, what was called luxury at the time, and the power of finance, what he called financial metaphysics, and to striking a balance between the potential energy and creativity of small-scale and free commerce and a state regulatory apparatus whose well-intentioned regulations all too often had counterproductive unintended consequences. These are, in a modern-sounding nutshell, the political problems that animated D'Argenson's writings, and they remain quintessential features of our political life today. Thank you. So he wanted to use this process called scrutin, which had been devised by the Abbé de Saint-Pierre, who was an important political thinker at the time, and I think still the only person ever to be kicked out of the Académie Française, but who's significantly older than him. But they meet in Madame de Lambert's salon, and Saint-Pierre becomes something of a mentor to D'Argenson. And I mean, Saint-Pierre, he's a bit of a quack, but he comes up with his own orthography and all this stuff. But anyway, he comes up with this system called scrutin, which is it's a version of election where basically people vote, and then the intendant looks at the results and chooses from among the top vote getters to make sure that it's sort of, someone who's qualified to hold the office. Now, this doesn't sound very democratic from our point of view, but for the 18th century France, this is pretty democratic. So he thinks this is going to sort of be that middle point between sort of full election, but not too disruptive. Well, I think that's a question I've pondered. I think part of it was the absence of these sources until 1976, that nobody knew that they were there, or at least not how many there were. And I think partly because, he's no Voltaire or Rousseau. I mean, in his writing, I don't think it's the quality of his thought is not at the sort of the Montesquieu, Rousseau, or Voltaire. But that's partly what makes him interesting. Is he's writing so much within the time and telling us about the time and advocating solutions to the time. But why? I don't know, to be honest. And I don't think I would have done this project if I hadn't been in the middle of a 2-year stay in France, where I was sort of immersed in French academia, and every French person, scholar was like, yes, there's no study like this has to be done, sort of thing. But, while if I had been here, I wouldn't have done it. So that's not a very good answer to the question of why, but it's just, I guess it was sort of sitting there. And in the question of influence, so the major municipal reforms are put in by a minister called Laverdy, and all the scholarship on it points to that as the key text and the sort of the circulation leading up to it, because it was in manuscript. It came out in 1764. How much it was sort of his ideas versus he was just sort of one of the people. I don't know enough about those reforms. There's a later movement for provincial assemblies, which he's very influential in, but he shouldn't be, because basically what happens is that his son comes up with an updated edition of the text in 1784, which he says is corrected based on a later manuscript, and I've seen the later manuscript. And there's nothing about provincial assemblies in the text. And basically his son rewrote the text sort of to be what D'Argenson would have said if he had been alive at that point, and sort of thrusts him into this debate for provincial assemblies that's beginning in the 1780s. So there's influence there, but it shouldn't be influence. Thank you. I was hoping someone would ask that. So, basically, he certainly read Bodin, or at least he had versions of it, because he uses some of Bodin's technical terms about the monarchy early in the text. And his interest in the sort of monarchical writers is when he's very involved in religious controversies in the 1730s. He goes reading them, and some of these manuscript sources are reading notes talking about those and changes to religious government, starts drawing comparisons to the Huguenots and how the Jansenists are being treated. So, the amount of time he spent reading is sort of incomprehensible. I mean, there was this reading craze in the 18th century, which people commented on at the time. But he was, I'm talking about, his thousands of reading notes, where the various influences on these ideas, they're endless because he's absorbing so much. Much of it's after the first draft of this, but Bodin is certainly there. Just in terms of who you mentioned, there's no question this is absolute and undivided sovereignty. I didn't have time to go into that, but he really isn't interested in the question of sovereignty. It just doesn't come up really. He just assumes it. But so, were there other particular thinkers you were interested in? Or? He's reading Boulainvilliers, he's reading Mézeray on feudalism. Cujas. It's sort of, the list is sort of endless. So, he was very careful about who he showed the manuscript to. At one point, Voltaire says, "Can I send it to Frederick the Great?" Because Frederick was not yet then the Great; he was still Crown Prince. And Voltaire and D'Argenson is like, "Are you crazy? There's no way this is circulating." And he's like, "Don't do anything, even in the postal coach. This has to be by courier." And his reasons actually for not sending it to Frederick are because of his basically patriotism. He said, "Why would I share this with the king of another country?" He says, I'm not advanced enough to be a cosmopolitan. I'm still a patriot first and foremost." But he showed it to Saint-Pierre, and Saint-Pierre showed it to Fontenelle. And so, there is, and then it circulates more and more later on, especially after his ministerial career ends in disgrace in 47. I think he does circulate it more then. I don't know how Rousseau got his hands on it. Rousseau's publisher, Marc-Michel Rey, says he got it from Kramer, who's Voltaire's publisher in Geneva. Rey is in Amsterdam. There's a story going on somewhere in there. And he was free enough with it that Dupont de Nemours has this weird anecdote in his memoirs where he says, "I was 16 and working as my father's apprentice, winding clocks, and I started talking to D'Argenson, and D'Argenson gave me his manuscript." So at that point, obviously, he was a little more free with it, that he gave it, and Dupont claims to have been a follower of D'Argenson ever since, but that happened in the 1750s, really, when, I think he had sort of hoped for a recall to the ministry, but he knew it wasn't going to happen.
Just like visions of he and his brother. The story of the brother.
Yeah, no, they clashed, and there's a whole history there too. That he thought his brother was corrupt and venal, and there's a more psychoanalytically inclined scholar would dive into how the father apparently always showed favoritism to the younger brother and things like that. But there's stuff going on there. So that journal entry from 1725, I think, is the first time I've seen something so clear like that. He didn't really keep much of a journal when he was younger, so I don't really know exactly. Maybe it was in his intendancy that ran from 20 to 24, and then he had an awful lot on the sort of the state of the province. Then maybe that was his first real exposure to sort of to rural poverty and sort of how bad things could be in the French countryside at the time. Basically, he just talks about the suffering. And says that this is how can people not sort of respond to this essentially. that people are, that there is this suffering in France's countryside going on at the time. I mean, I don't think there's anything specifically, like a text that I can think of where he points to the, influencing him on that point. I mean, everything I can remember, at least, is much more this descriptions of his own observations.